Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this conference. I've been asked to speak about what does regulation mean for cocoa and how will it affect the supply chain. Just a bit of history to start with. From a cocoa sustainability perspective, in 2000, the BBC documentary reported on child labour in cocoa farms in West Africa. And this kicked off really mainstream concern about sustainability and, in general, concerns around human rights, etc. From that was in the US, what's called the Harkin-Engle Protocol. Two senators in the US decided that they thought it was best to ban all cocoa coming from Ghana and Ivory Coast until the industry stated that that would probably cause more challenges to the countries of Ghana and Ivory Coast than trying to help solve the problem. So they then asked the industry to sign a protocol committing to eradicate child labour by 2015, which was obviously not happened. The WCF then became really a body about sustainability rather than about research. And then in 2002, the International Cocoa Initiative was founded mainly to concentrate on solving the challenges of child labour. 2007 was the first Rainforest Alliance certification in Ivory Coast, which was under initiative with Kraft Foods at the time, which is now Mondelez and Armajaro, and with trying to convert what was really a certification based around Latin American coffee rather than the West African cocoa. 2008, Cadbury set up the Cadbury Cocoa Partnership, which is now called Cocoa Life under Mondelez. Mars committed to 100% sustainable cocoa by 2020. In 2009, Nestle set up the Cocoa Plan in 2009 also. And then in 2011, Hershey and Ferrero also made commitments to be 100% sustainable by 2020. So as you can see, the bandwagon was really well and truly moving by the time. Again, Source Trust was set up, which then led to the founding of the Lint Foundation in 2013. And then in 2014, Cocoa Action was created by the World Cocoa Foundation, which was the first steps towards looking at impact rather than compliance. And that the Cocoa Action then led to what's called the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. So this impact started to really, people wanted to see actual progress, improved livelihoods, improved income, rather than just looking at compliance criteria, where in essence you were box ticking for against sets of criteria established by the voluntary standards. The lack of progress towards creation of digital data, because it was not required under these certifications, generated a lot of concerns about the robustness of the audits. And at the same time, as I said earlier, the brands were starting to look at outcome and impact, partly because of the Cocoa Action Initiative. So this is where the brands started looking towards their own programs like Cocoa Life, Cocoa Plan, Cocoa for Generations, Cocoa Horizons, Cocoa Promise, etc., rather than just relying on Rainforest Alliance, UTS at the time, which no longer exists, and fair trade. So if you're going to go down the impact approach, you have got to have digital data and traceability. If you're going to change the life of a farmer, living income, strive towards getting to a living income at farm level, you need to create farm development plans or farm business plans, which requires digital data. If you're going to ensure that you're complying with due diligence on human rights, particularly child labour, you need to have child labour monitoring and remediation systems, which again requires digital data. If you're making commitments on net zero, you need to have that location data. It's certainly geolocation, but almost certainly polygons for identifying your land use change footprint under Scope 3. Under the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, all the companies who are participating in that, which is up to around about 40 companies, have all made mapping and traceability commitments. And the same under the ISCOs, which so Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, France, and potentially the UK have got voluntary pledges from their industry and from their governments to have agroforestry, traceability, eradication of child labour, and all farmers with a living income between 2025 and 2030 for the cocoa that has been consumed in those countries. All of this requires significantly increased levels of digital data and traceability. But so over the last since 2018, there's been an initiative in Europe to create due diligence on regulation on deforestation. This was ironically initiated by a group which included industry in order to try and create a level playing field. It was the principle behind it was that the laggards, the people who don't really care, had a financial advantage because they were not having to take steps in terms of transparency and accountability than the ones who are playing according to the rules. So the principle behind the initiative was to try and encourage everyone to participate and ensure that the way to enforce that encouragement was by creating a regulation. This was rapidly adopted, particularly by the Parliament, but soon followed by the Council and the Commission. And what happens is that under the way the mechanism works, it requires the three entities to create a form of words which is approved by their specific membership. These form of words have now been negotiated under a trilogue, negotiated between the wording of the Parliament, the wording of the Council, and the wording of the Commission. The final form of words, which had recently been published but needs still to be voted on by the Parliament and the Council, is likely to be translated and published in some time around March 2023. So a month and a half, 2 months from now. Once that is published, there is a moratorium for activation of 18 months. Now, to all intents and purposes for the cocoa sector, that means main crop 2024 will be subject to the regulation. So what is the regulation? Here, let me just give you some highlights. The fundamental principle of this regulation is it's the reversal of the burden of proof. So if you don't have the data accompanying your parcel, it will be assumed to be guilty of deforestation. It's the opposite to normal law. That you have to be able to answer the question, has the parcel caused deforestation since the 31st of December 2020? Was the parcel grown illegally according to the laws of the country where it is grown, for example, in a protected or reserved area? And this has to be done by tracing all cocoa products. So it's not just beans, it's liquor, it's butter, it's powder, it's beans, it's cocoa content in chocolate. So all derivatives of cocoa back to their source farms and demonstrating each operator's due diligence. The products that are included in this first stage of the regulation are cocoa, coffee, soy, palm, rubber, cattle, and timber. And as I've already said, any derivatives of those products. So how will the regulation be implemented? Each country within the European Union will be required to appoint a competent authority within 6 months of the publication of the regulation. The competent authority has to create an information system which an operator has to log what's called a due diligence statement onto each time a product or a parcel enters or exits the European Union border. The competent authority can then identify whether deforestation has been caused or the parcel has been illegally grown. So what is the information required inside that due diligence statement? And this is really where it starts to become a completely new way of doing business. You need to have the farmer codes and master data of the farmers for every farmer contributing to that parcel. Traceability back to the production plots for all farms that have contributed to the parcel. So you have to be able to identify with either geolocation points for farms below 4 hectares or polygons for farms above 4 hectares to every single farm that's contributed, for example, to a 100-ton bill of lading. So the likelihood is that a 100-ton bill of lading will have the data for something like 500 farmers, because not all the cocoa from each farm is collected at the same time and delivered against one bill of lading. Over and above these requirements, there is potential for each competent authority of each country to create what is called commodity-specific guidelines. That means they can start changing the rules for cocoa versus coffee versus palm versus soy. So, for example, they might decide that cocoa has to have polygons for all the farms, because as we know, 90% of cocoa farms are less than 4 hectares. So having geolocation plots rather than polygons for less than 4 hectares means that there will be hardly any polygons required for cocoa, which makes it very difficult to monitor volumes coming from each farm if you don't know the exact farm size. Each operator is required to keep records for 5 years, and the format is that they have to be electronically available, transmittable, and certified statements that can confirm diligence was carried out. So you're under obligation to carry out your due diligence and prove that you have done so. So what steps can the competent authority take? Firstly, they can do random inspections. They can do field visits. They can inspect the records of the operators. They'll use satellite systems, and they can react to what's called substantiated claims. So if somebody either in the origin or at destination has a suspicion and has enough reasonable evidence that a parcel is containing cocoa that has caused deforestation, then they can present that as evidence to the competent authority, and the competent authority will react and inspect that parcel and the due diligence statement of that parcel. And what happens to the operators? There are substantial fines. There can the level of the maximum level of and the amount of a fine is 4% of the operator's annual turnover in the European Union as a whole. So they are extremely punitive and substantial fines. They also have the right to seize and destroy, or as it says in one of the forms of word, give to charity, the parcel in question. They can generate restriction of trade, certainly to public bodies of that operator, and the operator can be obliged to restore the environment and pay compensation to the affected parties of that deforestation. And the scenario is quite punitive for any operator that is carrying any of the products related to this regulation across the border, both going into the European Union and leaving from the European Union. So what is the current situation of the cocoa industry? I mean, are we ready for this? The current capability of the cocoa sector, I believe, is a challenge, partly because of the significant requirement of ESG and due diligence legislation across the globe. 70% of cocoa consumed, of the world's cocoa, is consumed by these regulated countries and regulated environments. The key challenge that the industry has is that they have probably got data on about 45% of the supply. It's what's called direct supply. It's where operators or middlemen, co-ops, etc., are supported by the big trade houses, the brands, and they have coaches on site and they're collecting the data and so on. But from that 45%, not all of that is digitally traceable, so proven where which farms have contributed to that parcel. They know that the parcel contains the cocoa from this co-op, but they may not know that the parcel contains the cocoa from the farmers in this co-op, and that's the key. So this is that 45% will be easily achievable because that is in the direct supply, and it's just a question of raising the 25% of compliant traceability up to the 45%. But as you can see, that still leaves a gap of about 25% to achieve 70% that is required under ESG and due diligence regulation. So what does the future look like? You know, the wording is now being finalized. As I stated, you can see some of the content there, which is things like geolocation up to 6 decimal places, longitude and latitude, polygons, traceability to farm level for all content of all parcels, etc. But also going forward, each EU country is mandated. It's mandatory for them to conform to this regulation. Next steps are human rights regulation, which will be initially issued as a directive, and that means that each country is directed to create regulation in their own country. So it's not a European level regulation, it's a directive from Europe that each country has to create their own regulation. And that is why it'll take till 2028, because it's a two-step approach rather than the deforestation regulation is an instant regulation at EU level. So at that point, even more data will be required. There will be social and demographic data. There will be child labour monitoring and remediation data required. And we will be going to the next step of transparency, traceability and accountability, which is the future of the industry as we know it. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions that may come. Thank you.